Welcome to History in Ashes, where we quietly stir the embers of the past to understand the world that shaped us. This isn't just a tale of great battles and forgotten kings, it's a history of survival, of choices that looked small at the time, but rippled through centuries. You're here because you're curious, because something inside you understands that even the dustiest details can hide something profound. In this video, we begin the first chapter of a story that reshaped Asia, Europe, and the fate of millions. How the Mongol Empire grew under Genghis Khan. But before we ride across the steppes or speak of bloodlines and betrayals, do me a small favor. Go to the comments and tell me where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'm guessing it's late. It always is when we find ourselves lost in stories like these. And while you're there, click that little red subscribe button. Think of it as joining a tribe. The kind that doesn't ask you to ride a horse into a snowstorm, just asks that you keep coming back for stories like this one. Now then, let's begin, not with a birth or a prophecy, but in the aftermath of vengeance. The year was 1221. The sky over Nishapur was a shade of white, so bright it seemed almost cruel. Snow had fallen for 3 days without pause, and now it clung to every ruined rooftop and twisted body in the city. The air smelled not of winter, but of iron, of blood, soaking frozen earth. You stand in the rubble, a survivor by accident. The wind howls through doorways with no doors. In the square where children once played, crows tear at red-stained cloaks. And all around you, silence. The kind that follows after something too massive to comprehend. This is where we begin. Genghis Khan, or as he was born, Temujin, did not personally stand in Nishapur that day. He was far away, already turning his eye to the west. But his empire was here, in its most ruthless form. And this massacre, this cold, calculated destruction, wasn't just the aftermath of conquest. It was a message, a warning, and a turning point. What led to this moment was not strategy alone. It was personal. Earlier that year, a Mongol detachment led by Tului, one of Genghis Khan's sons, had taken Nishapur as part of a broader campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire. After some resistance, the city had fallen. Its people, artisans, merchants, scholars, soldiers, were given terms. They surrendered. The Mongols, in typical fashion, installed a garrison and moved on. But rebellion followed. A Mongol commander named Tokuchar, Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed when the city rose up again. His death, more than the loss of strategic ground, was seen as an insult to the Khan's blood. The punishment was not a siege. It was an example. Tului returned to Nishapur with orders. The city was to be destroyed entirely. Every man, woman and child put to death. Not out of rage, out of calculation. This was a lesson in empire. Obedience was not optional. The price of defiance would not be measured in lives, but in entire populations. Chronicles later estimated over 100,000 dead. Some inflated that number, others contested it. But that detail, however shocking, isn't the point. The point is that it happened. That a city, once known for its poets and scholars, became a graveyard under falling snow. Among those scholars was Omar Khayyam's descendant, though little is known of his fate. Glassmakers, mathematicians, spice traders' names, never recorded, vanished. Here's something most people miss. The Mongols didn't destroy for pleasure. They destroyed with purpose. Cities that resisted were erased. Cities that submitted were often spared, even supported. This logic, while brutal, was strangely consistent. It was not about cruelty. It was about building something that would last, by ensuring resistance would not. But the violence wasn't clean. It never is. The foot soldiers, mostly drawn from the steppe, sometimes from conquered tribes, were not machines. They were men, and some among them began to question. The sheer scale of the killing haunted even Mongol generals. Years later, records show whispers of unease, even within the Khan's own ranks, but no one openly opposed the order. Because by then, Genghis Khan's empire wasn't just an army, it was a structure held together by loyalty, terror, opportunity, and a sense of something larger than any one man. Let's pause here. What did it mean to be a conqueror in the 13th century? Not simply to win battles, but to govern, to integrate, to survive winters in foreign lands and make roads where there were none. And sometimes, yes, to burn cities so thoroughly they would never rise again. When we speak of empire, we often imagine banners and horses and the roar of a battlefield. But empire also looked like this. A child clutching a blanket in a snow-covered alley. A scribe burying a book before he is found. A general standing over the ruins, wondering how history will judge this silence. And that silence would echo for years. But to understand how we got here, how a boy named Temujin, born into exile and starvation, became the most feared name across half the world, we must ride back. Back to the steppe, before the empires, before the titles, when survival was the only law, and everything a man owned could be stolen in the night. Because what happened in Nishapur wasn't just conquest, it was the final form of a childhood spent understanding one truth, that those who are not feared are forgotten. But was this fear sustainable? Could an empire built on ash and loyalty endure beyond the man who forged it? That's a question history would ask again and again. The wind on the steppe is not like wind elsewhere. It doesn't just push or howl, it strips. It removes what is soft and keeps what is hard. It whittles men down to their hunger and horses down to their bones. There are no stone cities here, only open sky, brittle grass, and people shaped by both. You're standing now on the edge of the Onon River in what we today call northeastern Mongolia. But no one called it that then. It was just the world, as far as the eye could see, wide enough that you could live and die without seeing a mountain, yet close enough that one clan's sorrow might reach another in a single day. Temujin was born here in the year 1162, and he was born into trouble. His father, Yasuge, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a name that held meaning, but not power. There were no great palaces. His people lived in felt tents, moved with the seasons, and survived by trading, hunting, or raiding. Power on the steppe wasn't permanent. It was earned and lost over and over again. On the day Temujin was born, Yasuge had just returned from a raid, bringing with him a captive Tatar he intended to make his wife. But by the customs of the time, he allowed her to choose her eldest son's name. She chose Temujin, a name meaning blacksmith, after a man her husband had just killed. It was not a blessed beginning. And just like that, the baby who would one day erase whole cities was wrapped in furs beneath a sky so vast it made every life feel small. As a child, Temujin had little. His family had milk if the animals lived through winter, dried meat if the hunt was kind. When it wasn't, they ate roots, rodents, or the sinew of old bones. Warmth came from the bodies of siblings huddled in a yurt, with felt so thin you could see the moonlight bleed through. He wasn't alone. His brothers were many. So were his enemies. Because power on the steppe wasn't built on crownsit, was built on alliances. Temporary, fragile, bloodbound or broken by insult. And Yasuge, Temujin's father, had enemies. One of them poisoned him during a meal not long after the boy turned 9. That left Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his siblings alone, abandoned by their clan, exiled to survive with no warriors, no herds, no support. You need to understand this. Exile on the steppe was not symbolic. It was a death sentence written without a blade. Without a tribe, you were nothing. You could be killed by anyone, and no one would sing a song about it. Starvation, wolves, rival stake your pick, all waited just beyond the firelight. So Helen, a woman stolen in a raid, now became something more. She didn't mourn. She gathered her children and taught them how to scrape marrow from bones, how to trap marmots, how to dig for edible roots in frost-hardened earth. She taught them something the men often forgotho to endure. Temujin watched his mother take command of a family no one else would touch, and this memory, this lesson followed him into every campaign he ever waged. Still, the hardship twisted him. One day, Temujin's older half-brother, Bekta, hoarded food and refused to share. In a place where food meant life, this was more than selfish, it was betrayal. Temujin and his full brother, Kasar, killed him. Let that settle. Not in rage, not in chaos, but because leadership among exiles demanded action, and Temujin would not tolerate betrayal, even in blood, especially in blood. Some say this act hardened him. Others say it simply revealed what the steppe required. That loyalty was not a birthright. It was a choice, and it came with consequences. He was still just a boy. But boys on the steppe became men, the moment they realized no one else was coming to save them. Years passed. Seasons spun like wheels. Temujin, his brothers, and their mother survived. Barely. They fished with bones, fought wild dogs for scraps. He was captured once by the Taichi Ud clan and made a slave. Tied to a wooden collar, watched by guards, treated like cattle. But he escaped. Not with brute force, but with the help of a kind man from the same tribe who took pity on him. This memory, too, stayed with him. The idea that sometimes mercy came from the unlikeliest hand. And loyalty, once earned, could be deeper than fear. He grew older, and with age came recognition. Temujin began to gather allies, not just by name or tribe, but by promise. He offered them something unusual for the time merit. A chance to rise not by bloodline but by loyalty, talent, and bravery. That was new, that was dangerous. And it worked. He started winning. Small things, at first raids, skirmishes, alliances sealed with milk and arrows. But soon, the whispers began. Who is this boy, once starving in the hills, now riding with dozens at his back? What does he want? The truth is, Temujin didn't want revenge. He didn't want chaos. He wanted to build something that could not be taken from him by poison, winter, or exile. Something no rival could undo with a whispered insult. An empire? Not yet. First he needed a tribe. But even tribes fracture. Even brothers betray. So here's the question. If a man learns from starvation, exile, and murder that loyalty is everything, what happens when those closest to him break that trust? What does he build next? And more importantly, how far will he go to protect it? There are places in the world where the land itself teaches you who you are. Not with words, but with weather, with silence, with absence. The Mongolian steppe is one of those places. You don't thrive here by strength alone. You learn to really listen to the rhythm of hoofbeats, the snap of a bowstring, the distant bark of wolves. You learn that the ground gives nothing freely, but it does reveal everything. Who came through last, how many horses they had, whether they were desperate. The wind doesn't just chill your bones, it tells you stories, if you're quiet enough. This was the world that raised Temujin. No walls, no libraries, just endless horizon and necessity. He was not the only one raised this way. Dozens of clans drifted across the grasslands, each one a web of marriages, grudges, and uneasy alliances. Tribes like the Merkits, the Naimans, the Tatars, the Keriit, the Taichiud, each spoke similar tongues. Each rode horses, hunted deer, wore furs, and drank fermented mare's milk. And each knew, deep down, that alliances were measured in seasons. What separated Temujin wasn't where he came from. It was how he thought. Most steppe leaders fought to protect what they had, honor, family. But Temujin had already lost all of that. He had nothing to protect, only something to build. That gave him a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to think differently. And so, he watched people closely. He noticed who took orders well, and who gave them poorly. He noticed that loyalty was more precious than blood, and more fragile. He noticed that cruelty, used sparingly, had weight, but cruelty used carelessly was just noise. He began gathering followers not through conquest, but through shared hardship. One of the first was Bo Chu, a boy from a neighboring clan who once helped Temujin recover stolen horses. Afterward, Bo Chu returned home, only to tell his father that he was leaving, that his loyalty belonged to Temujin now, not out of duty, but respect. Another was Jelmi, a warrior who would one day carry Temujin off a battlefield bleeding from 7 wounds, sucking the clots from his throat so he could breathe. Jelmi was not of high birth, but Temujin didn't care. These were not just friendships. These were the foundations of something new, something that challenged the old steppe order, where nobles ruled by inheritance and the rest bowed by birth. Still, the old world hadn't vanished. Temujin's past reached for him again when the Merkit tribe kidnapped his wife, Berta. It wasn't just a raid, it was a message. You may be rising, but you are not untouchable. He didn't have the strength to challenge the Merkits alone, so he did something different. He reached out to the man who had once sworn blood brotherhood with him, Jamukha. Jamukha had been Temujin's childhood friend. They had hunted together, sworn oaths together, but their paths had diverged. Jamukha came from noble lineage, Temujin did not. Jamukha believed in tradition, nobles on top, commoners below. Temujin believed in merit. Still, they united. Along with Wang Khan, a Kharit leader who had once taken Temujin in as a boy, they rode against the Merkits together, and they won. Berta was rescued. A son was born soon after Jochi, but questions lingered about the boy's true parentage. No one said it out loud, but no one forgot it either. Temujin didn't waste time on gossip. He rewarded his allies, forgave those who bent the knee, and kept moving forward. But this alliance with Jamukhite wouldn't last. Jamukha saw what Temujin was building. Not a warband, but a new kind of tribione that accepted outsiders, elevated talent over blood, and punished betrayal without ceremony. This was not the old way. So Jamukha gathered his own forces. He painted Temujin as a heretic, a traitor to tradition. The two would clash soon enough. But before that, Temujin made a quiet move that would change everything. He began promoting men from humble origins, not just for loyalty, but for skill. This terrified the nobles, because it meant they could be replaced. And Temujin didn't do it with speeches or declarations. He simply acted. A herder, who had once delivered messages through a blizzard, was suddenly given command over warriors. A smith's son, skilled in crafting arrows, was made a quartermaster. This meritocracy quiet, steady was more revolutionary than any battle. The old clans saw it as a threat to their way of life. And maybe it was. But to the poor, the disenfranchised, the skilled but overlooked, Temujin was something else. He was a chance. He didn't give land. He gave roles, purpose, a place to belong in a world that otherwise chewed you up and spat you into the snow. And that sense of belonging, that strange, fragile glue was what allowed him to grow. So here's the real question. What happens when a man builds a new system in a world that only knows how to destroy? Will it survive long enough to matter? Or will the old world crush it before it can take root? The sky was grey the day they met on the plain. Not the gentle grey of a rain-soaked spring, but the dull, heavy kind that presses down on your bones. You could feel it in your chest, like the land itself was waiting to see what would happen. Temujin stood on one side, with a growing force of warriors behind him who had followed him through hardship, who had seen how he rewarded loyalty not with gold, but with responsibility. Across the field, Jamukha gathered the traditionalist tribes. His banners fluttered in the windled emblems, old bloodlines. It wasn't just a battle of two men, it was a battle between two systems. Temujin's army wasn't the largest, but it was tighter, organized, structured, divided into tens, hundreds, and thousands each, with appointed leaders, chosen for skill, not name. This decimal system was new on the steppe, and it allowed orders to ripple across the army like wind over grass. Jamukha had more men, but they came from the old order, nobles with their own commands, warriors loyal to their own lineage first, the greater cause second. The battle began. At first, it seemed even. Arrows darkened the sky. Riders swept wide, trying to flank. Horses screamed. Men shouted across the wide-open plain. Dust rose in thick clouds. But then, the weight of numbers told the story. Temujin's side, outnumbered nearly 2-1, began to fall back. A retreat measured, not panicked, but a retreat all the same. Jamukha had won. And yet, what followed turned the victory bitter. After the battle, Jamukha executed 70 young warriors from Temujin's ranks. But he didn't just kill them, he boiled them alive. It shocked the steppe. Even among warriors hardened by years of bloodshed, this act felt excessive, unnecessary. It revealed something Jamuka didn't mean to show. Fear. Fear of what Temujin represented. Fear that this upstart, this man of no noble birth, had come closer to victory than he should have. Temujin, beaten but not broken, vanished into the grasslands. He would spend the next several years rebuilding, slowly, steadily. Every defeat taught him something. Every betrayal clarified who he could trust. And over time, something strange began to happen. More and more, the discontented began drifting toward Temujin. Exiles, younger sons, orphaned herders, skilled craftsmen those, with no place in the old order. They saw in him not just a leader, but a future where they mattered. And this time, Temujin was patient. He forged alliances through marriage. He offered his daughters to leaders of smaller clans, sealing bonds not just with words, but with blood. He let his enemies underestimate him, thinking him broken, forgotten, but he never stopped preparing. He trained his men in discipline. He created laws Yassa that applied to all, regardless of status. No theft, no adultery, no fighting among comrades. Food was to be shared. Spies were to be protected. Obedience was not blinded, was built on mutual survival. When his strength returned, it wasn't loud. It was like snow, accumulating on a mountain. Quiet, until it crushed everything below. In time, the old alliances around Jamuka began to crack. Some of his own began reaching out to Temujin, secretly, cautiously. They had seen enough. Then the tide turned. In a renewed conflict, Temujin defeated Jamuka decisively. This time he had more than numbers. He had a vision, one that was becoming increasingly hard to ignore. Jamuka was captured by his own men, who hoped to save their lives by delivering him to Temujin. And here's where the story shifts again. Temujin did not kill Jamuka immediately. He offered him a place by his side, a reconciliation. After all, they had once been blood brothers. Oaths made in youth are hard to forget. But Jamuka refused. He said there could not be two suns in the sky. And then he asked for death. Temujin granted it not with torture, not with spectacle, but with mercy. Some sources say he was executed quietly, without pain. What does that tell you? This was not a man driven by vengeance. He was not interested in theatre. What he cared about was stability, control, legacy. Because by now, Temujin had begun to understand that power was not just about conquest, it was about order. He had seen what chaos did. He had lived in it, been exiled by it, nearly starved because of it. And now he was shaping a new kind of empire, one that could outlive him. But in doing so, he had to make difficult choices to determine what kind of loyalty was worth keeping, and what kind of brotherhood could be sacrificed. So here's your question. If the bonds of youth and blood are not enough to hold power together, what is? What truly binds people? Fear, love, law, or something else entirely? It began with a bride, not the kind from stories, not wrapped in silk or married in gold. She wore wool and leather. She lived in a tent. And yet, her disappearance would set off a chain of events that changed the face of the world. Temujin was young when he first saw her birthday. She was from the Ongirut tribe, and in steppe tradition, their marriage was arranged by their fathers. But something rare happened. They liked each other, maybe even loved. That matters more than people think. Because when everything else is stripped away, title, land, cattle, sometimes all that's left is a name you can whisper across a battlefield. Berta was that name. Temujin married her as soon as he could. He gave her a sable coat to her father as a bride price. It was one of the few valuable things he owned. And when she came to live with him, she didn't marry into wealth or power. She married into exile, hunger, and danger. But she didn't leave. She stayed in the thin-walled yurt through winters that killed livestock and summers that brought raiders. She gathered firewood. She cared for Temujin's younger siblings. She became part of the thread holding his fragile world together. Then, one day, she was taken. It was the Murkitsan, old enemy of Temujin's father. Some say it was revenge. Others say it was just opportunity. But they came quickly, like most raids did. They stole livestock, set fire to tents, and they took Bertay. In a single night, Temujin lost not just his wife, but the very idea of what he was building. You have to understand what that meant on the steppe. A man without a wife was no man at all. His household collapsed, his alliances weakened, his ability to command respect gone. It wasn't just love or grief, it was status, it was survival. And for Bertawell, her fate was worse. Captured women in steppe raids were passed around, bartered, used, discarded. No one expected Temujin to get her back, not with so few warriors, not with so little power. But this was not a man who forgot insults. And this was not a man who abandoned those who stayed with him when he had nothing. So he did something unusual. He went to his blood brother, Jamuka. The two had drifted apart, but the old bond was still there. Temujin also reached out to Wang Khan, the ruler of the Khwarezm, who had once taken him in like a foster son. He asked for help not to conquer, not to raid, but to rescue. And they agreed. The alliance rode north. Dozens of warriors, maybe more. They hit the Merkits fast, before word could spread. The attack wasn't just tactical, it was surgical. Bertay was found, alive. Some say she had already been given to a Merkit man as a wife, a word that hides too much. But she came back, and not long after, she gave birth to a son Jochi. And just like that, a new shadow entered Temujin's life. Because everyone knew the timeline didn't quite add up. Was Jochi Temujin's biological son? No one could say. And Temujin never spoke a harsh word about it. He claimed Jochi, raised him, trained him, trusted him, but others whispered. Even inside his family, questions grew. And in time, those questions would tear at the very fabric of the empire Temujin was building. Still at this moment, he had his wife back, his household restored, his alliances growing, and the people around him saw something else, something bigger. Here was a man who kept promises, who remembered kindness, who punished betrayal, and who came back for those he loved. This story, this rescue, circulated across the tribes. It became part of the oral memory of the steppe. Not just because it was bold, but because it broke the script. Most men would have mourned and moved on. Temujin did not. And in doing so, he reminded people that power could come not just from fear, but from resolve, from memory, from loyalty returned, from relationships built in hunger and tested in fire. And Berta? She remained by his side for life, through conquest, through coronation, through loss. She was the only empress he ever named, even when he could have had dozens. That meant something. It meant that behind the rise of a world-shaking empire stood a woman who once gathered firewood in silence, while the wolves circled just beyond the fire. So here's your question. Is the foundation of empire built on armies, or on the ones we choose not to abandon? The thing no one tells you about power is this. It's mostly maintenance. You spend more time writing letters than drawing swords, more time weighing gifts than giving orders. Most of empire isn't conquest, it's accounting. Temujin understood this early. And not because anyone taught him, but because he had nothing to fall back on. His claim to power wasn't rooted in noble birth, but in the fragile promises of those who chose to follow him. That kind of leadership can't afford neglect. After Bertay's rescue, his reputation grew. He wasn't just a skilled horseman or clever tactician. He was a man who kept his word. He rewarded bravery, remembered kindness, and punished betrayal. And in the steppe where tomorrow's alliance might become today's ambush, this consistency was rare. It was currency. But consistency alone isn't enough. You have to manage people. And people, especially those with horses and weapons, are complicated. Temujin's strength was growing. His followers now included not just warriors, but shepherds, bowyers, blacksmiths, and children. He had to feed them, move them, protect them, which meant politics. Steppe politics weren't written in scrolls. They were felt in tone, posture, silence. A missed invitation to share fermented milk. A marriage proposal that was delayed. a messenger's horse that arrived a day too late. Every action had meaning, and Temujin had to read all of it carefully, because not everyone was happy with the way things were going. He was promoting men of low birth. That threatened the old nobility. He was forging alliances with weaker clans, giving them influence they'd never had. That upset the powerful, and he was changing the ruler slowly, but unmistakably. His laws, the beginnings of what would become the Yassa, demanded order in a place where chaos had always been the norm. Theft was now punishable. Rape, which had long been ignored in the aftermath of raids, was now a crime. Leaders were responsible for their men's actions, even nobles. This wasn't generosity, it was design. Temujin was creating a system where power came not from lineage, but from reliability. He wanted people to look at his rule and see something they could predict, something they could survive under. But predictability makes some men restless. A noble named Taichidonce, a captor of Temujin when he was a boy, began stirring opposition. Others joined him quietly, fearing the loss of their inherited privileges. They began reaching out to Jamuka again, sensing an opportunity to re-establish the old way. It was a familiar story. Powerful men, threatened by change, trying to pull the world back into their control. And for a time, they succeeded. As Temujin's influence expanded, Jamuka returned to the scene not just as a rival, but now as the figurehead of traditionalism. The clans gathered under him not because they loved him, but because they feared what Temujin was building. They called him a usurper, a pretender, a destroyer of ancient customs. Temujin didn't argue. He organized. He gathered his men and divided them again into units of 10, 100, 1,000. He appointed leaders not from bloodlines, but from proven loyalty. The decimal system became not just a way to fight, but a way to govern. It ensured that no single noble could command too much on his own. Everyone answered upward, in layers, like a ladder. Even the camp itself was reorganized. Tents were set in regular rows. Positions were assigned, discipline enforced. The Mongol camp became a military diagram, not a village. But the old world wouldn't go quietly. When Temujin and Jamuka clashed again, it was more than a battle. It was a referendum. Jamuka's forces captured and executed Temujin's men in that notorious boiling 70 young warriors, scalded alive. It backfired. The steppe respected cruelty when it was calculated. But this felt excessive, wasteful, emotional. Temujin waited. He made no grand gesture, no revenge play. Instead, he focused on what he could control, strengthening his networks, winning more converts, expanding the reach of his law. And over time, the cracks in Jamuka's coalition widened. His alliance was built on fear, not loyalty. When his nobles saw Temujin's rise as inevitable, they betrayed Jamuka and delivered him bound. Temujin accepted the offering, but not with spectacle. No grand parades, no boiling. He offered Jamuka a place beside him, and Jamuka refused. Some say it was pride. Some say he feared living in the shadow of the man he once called brother. Some say he preferred death to compromise. Temujin respected the choice and ended his life cleanly. No pain, no theatre, just silence. And maybe that's what made the message louder. The new way had no need for spectacle. It had structure, order, memory. With Jamuka gone and the old noble alliances crumbling, the steppe had a new center. But the question still lingered in the minds of many. Could a world as fragmented and wild as this really hold together under law? Could politics, paperwork, and loyalty truly replace bloodlines and fear? Or was this all just a fragile illusion on bad season away from collapse? There are words that change when they're spoken aloud. Khan was one of them. It meant leader, yes, but not just of a tribe, not just of a war band. To call someone Khan was to recognize that your fate rested in his hands, that his enemies were your enemies, that his laws would reach into your tent, your family, your days. And when Temujin was declared Genghis Khan universal rule, everything changed. Not all at once, and not for everyone, but the steppe felt it, like the first deep crack in a lake's ice before it breaks. It was the year 1206. The clans gathered on the Onon River. The wind, they say, was calm that day, unusual for the region. Tents stretched across the plain in every direction, thousands of people, horses, carts, dogs, children. Some had ridden for days, others had never come so far east, but they came, not out of fear, out of necessity. Temujin stood before them now, not as a hungry boy, not as an exile, not as a rebel, but as a man who had survived everything the steppe could throw at him and brought order to it. He had crushed Jamukha, reorganized society, stabilized the law, and built something that hadn't existed before, a central identity that stretched across clans. And when the nobles lifted him up not just in ceremony, but in genuine acknowledgement, became Genghis Khan. Not a family name, a title, a turning point. But let's be clear, this wasn't a coronation in the way Europe understood it. There was no crown, no altar. This was done in the Kurultai, traditional Mongol council of chiefs. Every major decision passed through it. This was a society where even revolution required a vote. And the vote was yes. Yes, to Genghis Khan. Yes, to unity through strength. Yes, to a future written not by noble houses, but by survival and allegiance. From that point on, things accelerated. The empire wasn't built from brick and marble. It was built from bones and resolve. But it had form. Genghis Khan divided his people into military units, structured, clear, reliable. He reorganized the clans, breaking up old loyalties, intermixing groups, forcing them to identify not by lineage, but by allegiance to him. It was genius. Dangerous genius. By eliminating hereditary privilege among the steppe nobility, he ensured that no rival faction could rise on blood alone. Advancement now depended on performance, loyalty, obedience. And this wasn't just for warriors. Even messengers who could ride over 200 miles in a single day were protected by law. Killing one was punishable by death. The message mattered more than the man. Why? Because information was the bloodstream of empire. Genghis Khan needed to know what was happening in every corner of his growing realm. He needed to move troops swiftly, identify rebellion early, and feed his people before famine arrived. So he created the Yama relay system of riders and way stations across the land. It's dull, maybe, compared to battles, but it's what made the empire work. The kind of thing history usually forgets, even though everything depends on it. The law system was expanded. Theft, punishable by death. Kidnapping women, death. Lying under oath, death. But also protection for those who submitted. Farmers who paid tribute were to be left alone. Religious figures, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Taoist were to be respected. The message was simple. Obey, and you will survive. Resist, and you will vanish. It sounds cold, and it was. But it also created the conditions for peace across a territory where nothing but raiding and revenge had ruled for centuries. People could trade, travel, build, herd, rest. And rest, on the steppe, was rare. Still, not everyone was ready to rest. Outside the borders of the new Mongol identity, enemies waited. The Jin dynasty to the south, the Xixia to the west, the Khwarezmians further beyond. Powerful empires, ancient cities, silk, salt, gold. Genghis Khan saw them not as threats, but as answers. To maintain order, he needed resources. To keep warriors loyal, he needed reward. And to secure the empire's edges, he needed to expand. But conquest alone wasn't enough. He needed something more. A reason. He would find it soon in insults, broken treaties, and murdered envoys. But for now, here on the banks of the Onon, the newly declared Khan stood in silence while the wind rolled low across the grass. Around him, the future looked open and empty. But he knew better. He had built unity where there had only been division. And in doing so, he had awakened something bigger than himself. So here's your question. Once a man becomes more than a Menonce, he becomes a symbol, a law, a nation. Can he ever go back? Or is he forever at war with what he once was? A symbol is only as strong as the people who carry it. Temujin had become Genghis Khan. Yes, but an empire does not survive on titles alone. It survives on tension, on balance, on keeping just enough people afraid and just enough people hopeful. And Genghis was a master of this quiet warfare. After the Kurultai, the empire needed feeding politically, economically, emotionally. No empire begins with stability. It begins with energy. Restless, chaotic, violent energy. For the Mongols, that meant expansion was not a luxury, but a matter of survival. If they didn't move outward, they'd collapse inward. Genghis understood this better than anyone. So he turned his gaze west, toward the Tangut-led Xi kingdom. It was not the richest kingdom, nor the most threatening, but it was walled, sedentary, and old. That made it symbolic. The Mongols had clashed with them before. Now, Genghis Khan wanted submission. In 1206, they launched their first major campaign as a united force under the new Mongol order. Tens of thousands of riders moved westward quick, light, organized. The Xia had walls and cities. The Mongols had horses and strategy. It wasn't a fair fight. They didn't attack like armies. They attacked like weather. One detachment would approach from the north, another from the south, splitting, vanishing, reappearing where they shouldn't be. They faked retreats. They cut supply lines. They surrounded before they were seen. They didn't just fight men, they fought communication itself. Sieges were a new kind of challenge. The Mongols had never relied on fortresses, and now they had to conquer them. So they adapted, quickly. Engineers were recruited, often captured Chinese and Muslim specialists who brought knowledge of siege machines, sappers, fire launchers. By 1209, Yinchuan, the Xia capital, was under siege. The Mongols dammed a river to flood the city. It failed, though not before terrifying everyone behind the walls. Eventually, the Tangut king agreed to become a vassal, promising tribute and support. It was a quiet defeat, negotiated rather than imposed. Genghis Khan didn't need total destruction yet. He needed the message. The Mongols could crack walls. That was new and terrifying, but it wasn't enough. The real threat, what kept Genghis awake, was the Jin dynasty to the southeast. They had once supported him, had accepted tribute from his enemies, had looked down on steppe life as barbarism. Their empire stretched across northern China, old, rich, rigid. Their military was large, but their strategy was predictable. In 1211, Genghis began preparing. This was no raid. This was a full war engine, a test of the new Mongol system. Mobilization was efficient. Soldiers were organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These were not temporary squads, but permanent structures. You didn't fight beside your cousin because he was your cousin. You fought beside him because you trained together, lived together, and answered to the same command. Every warrior brought his own weapons, horse, and gear. No long supply trains. Mobility over armor. They could travel nearly 100 miles in a day lightning across the plains. But what most forget, they did not always kill. Submission was always the first offer. Villages that opened their gates were often spared. Those that resisted even for a day were annihilated. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, it was policy. Mercy had to be predictable. So did destruction. The Jin dynasty did not fall quickly. Their cities were fortified, their armies large, but their internal politics were brittle. And Genghis exploited it. In 1213, the Mongols broke through northern defenses. Town after town surrendered. And by the time the capital Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was under siege in 1215, the pattern was clear. The old world was cracking. Here's where the quiet details matter. After the surrender of Zhongdu, the Jin court tried to buy peace with gold, silver, women, and horses. And Genghis accepted. For a while. Then he retreated slowly, deliberately, not because he was done, but because the season was changing, and his men were tired. Winter on the steppe is not a thing to underestimate, but the Jin had misunderstood this withdrawal as defeat. A mistake. Genghis returned the following spring. He wasn't just punishing betrayal, he was studying. He watched how grain moved, how walls cracked under fire, how panic traveled through civilian populations. He was creating a mental map, not just of the terrain, but of empire itself. And every move made the Mongol system more efficient, more adaptable. The Yam expanded. New legal codes were issued. Spiesnoker, loyal bondsmen, were sent into new cities disguised as merchants or translators. They didn't just report on troop positions. They listened to rumors, tested gates, mapped water sources. It was the invisible war that shaped the visible one. And at the center of it was Genghis Khan, calculating, often weeks ahead of everyone else. But he was not immortal. He had 4 sons, and an empire that needed dividing. So, he began naming generals, trusted friends, loyal warriors, even Sonsto command whole wings of the army. This delegation was not weakness. It was legacy. Genghis knew what every old herder on the steppe knew, that a yurt survives not because it's strong, but because every part is balanced. Struts, skin, rope each holding the other. And so, the empire grew like that. Balanced, flexible, slightly swaying in the wind. But you have to wonder, when power becomes structure, does it lose something? Does the fire that built it still burn once it's safe inside walls? Imagine a thunderstorm. You don't know where it started, or where it will end. You only know that it's coming fast, and you're in its path. That's what it felt like when the Mongols came to war. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan had reshaped his once fractured people into a force capable of breaking cities and dynasties. But more than his conquests, it was how he conquered that shook the world. Because war, to the Mongols, was not a ritual or a chess game. It was an instrument tuned, sharpened, and played without hesitation. You're watching History in Ashes, where we breathe new life into forgotten dust. If you're still here, take a moment, drop into the comments, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Because somewhere, someone's learning history at 3 in the morning, and Genghis would respect that kind of dedication. And hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, just imagine trying to outrun a Mongol cavalry charge. You'd wish you had clicked that button before they showed up at your gates. Now, let's walk through how warfare, boring, logistical, technical warfare became the very engine of empire. Start with structure. The army was divided into Arbans, 10 men, Zuns, 100, Mingans, 1,000, and Tumans, 10,000. It sounds bureaucratic, and it was. But this was not idle organization. It was survival through clarity. You knew who led you. You knew who buried you. Each unit trained together, ate together, died together. Loyalty wasn't a romantic bond, it was an agreement of function. This structure allowed entire Tumans to move independently, yet with shared tactics, signals, and goals. It also made the Mongol army incredibly hard to break. Kill a general? Another steps in. Wipe out 100? 1,000 adapts. They trained with discipline, not passion. Mongol boys began riding by the age of 3. By 12, they could fire a bow accurately while galloping at full speed. Every man in the army brought his own bow, arrows, tools, and at least 3 horses. 3. Why 3? Because speed was everything. With multiple horses, riders could switch between them, letting one rest while riding another. This gave Mongol armies an average speed of 70 to 100 miles per day, unheard of in medieval warfare. Most armies crawled. The Mongols flowed. Then came their tactics. They perfected feigned retreats. Imagine it. A Mongol force charges your camp, hurls arrows, then suddenly flees in apparent panic. You chase them, of course you do, and then, without warning, you're encircled, flanked, cut down before you realize you were never in control. Other armies fought with banners and honor. The Mongols fought with deception and silence. They used smoke to blind defenders. They lit fires behind enemy lines to sow confusion. They even left small camps burning at night to suggest large armies were resting nearby, when in reality, the real attack was happening far away. They were not just good warriors. They were good learners. Every conquered people brought new knowledge. Chinese engineers taught them siege warfare. Persian administrators showed them systems of taxation and record-keeping. Muslim doctors helped organize battlefield medicine. This wasn't assimilation. It was absorption. They took what worked and made it theirs. Then there was the Yamthi-Mongol relay system. Picture a network of stations, spaced about 20 to 30 miles apart, where fresh horses and riders waited. Messages could travel hundreds of miles per day. It wasn't just military. It was civilization. Orders moved faster than rebellion. Food and intelligence moved faster than famine. An empire that could respond quickly could survive. But for all their efficiency, Mongol warfare was also brutally simple. If a city resisted even briefly, it was often destroyed completely. Not out of bloodlust, but policy. Genghis believed that mercy must be predictable, and so must consequences. He sent clear terms: surrender and live, resist and vanish. And many cities did vanish. Whole populations gone. But we must resist the temptation to simplify this as mere savagery. To the Mongols, this wasn't chaos, it was order. A way to impose rules where none existed before. Even amidst carnage, they banned looting until after full conquest. They punished soldiers who raped, stole, or disobeyed orders, sometimes with death. Genghis Khan issued one of the earliest known sets of codified laws, the Yassa, a secretive, unwritten set of rules that governed everything from theft to adultery to military discipline. The idea wasn't morality. It was function. A man could be poor, foreign, or former enemy, but if he obeyed the Yassa, he could be trusted. Meritocracy harsh, impersonal, and real was the glue of the Mongol system. And yet, even as the war machine perfected itself, cracks formed. Genghis had sons each ambitious, each loyal to him, but perhaps not to each other. As the empire grew, so did the distances between commanders, brothers, and advisors. Genghis had built something new on the bones of the old. But how long could it stay new? And when speed itself became the foundation of empire, what happens when that speed is no longer enough? The thunder of hooves fades, but the empire remains. Conquest is loud, administration is quiet. You might think the Mongol story is just about horses, arrows, and sieges. But the empire's true test was what came next. What do you do when you hold not just a tribe, but cities, thousands of people, many of them strangers? How do you keep peace in lands where your language is unknown, your customs alien, your rule unwelcome? These were the questions Genghis Khan faced as his armies swept through Central Asia. He inherited not an empty steppe, but a patchwork of settled civilizations. Persian merchants, Muslim scholars, Chinese bureaucrats, Turkic tribes, and many more. The Mongols had no experience governing cities or managing complex economies. Yet, they had no choice. The solution was pragmatism. Genghis Khan allowed conquered peoples to keep their leaders as long as they paid tribute and obeyed the Yassa. He trusted local administrators, often former enemisto, run day-to-day affairs. He respected religions. Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, Christian priests, they all found protection under Mongol law. This was unusual. Many empires demanded cultural or religious conformity. The Mongols did not. But pragmatism had limits. Some governors abused their power. Some people resisted. To maintain order, Genghis Khan created an intelligence network. Spies reported on rebellions before they sparked. Messengers carried warnings across vast distances. Loyalty was rewarded, treason punished swiftly. Trade flourished under Mongol protection. The famous Silk Road reopened, safer than it had been in centuries. Caravans crossed deserts and mountains with less fear of bandits. Ideas traveled to technologies, philosophies, even diseases. The world was becoming connected in ways no one expected. But these connections brought new challenges. The empire's growth spread it thin. Communications slowed. Local rulers sometimes acted independently. And the sons of Genghis Khan grew restless. Power shared among brothers is a delicate balance. Temujin, the youngest, stayed loyal and quiet. Jochi, whose birth was shadowed by questions, sought recognition. Chagatai was strict, sometimes cruel. Ogadai, the chosen heir, was steady and pragmatic. Their rivalries, tempered under Genghis's rule, would erupt later. For now, the empire was still held together by the man who had built it. But as winter approaches, even the strongest horses tire. And when the rider is gone, what becomes of the empire? So here's your question. Can a system built on speed, law, and ruthless pragmatism survive the messiness of human ambition and family? Or will it fracture under its own weight? For all his power, Genghis Khan was still a man who knew his time was limited. As the empire grew, so did the question hanging over everything. Who would inherit this new world? Temujin's sons were many, but not equal. Jochi's legitimacy was doubted by some because of Berta's capture years earlier. Ogadai was chosen heir, but that didn't end rivalries. Chagatai was proud, stubborn, and feared by many. Tolui, the youngest, was strong and loyal but young. Succession was not just a family matter, it was an empire-wide crisis waiting to happen. The Mongols had no clear tradition for inheritance like European kingdoms. Power had always been won, not given. Yet Genghis realized that to hold the empire together, he needed to build a new tradition. He chose Ogadai to succeed Hema decision, meant to balance competence and loyalty. But even as he named an heir, he warned his sons and generals, unity must come first. The Kurultai that would later confirm Ogadai's position was a ceremony filled with tension. Some nobles resented the choice. Others feared fragmentation. Genghis's own health was failing. But before he died, he sent his generals out. Not just to conquer more land, though they would, but to secure loyalty, gather resources, and prepare the empire for what was next. This was a turning point. The man who had risen from exile and exile again was no longer here. His vision, law, and system remained, but without him, the bonds holding the empire together would be tested like never before. You begin to see the human side beneath the empire's steel. Brothers with ambitions, generals with grudges, nobles with old loyalties, and a people stretched across continents and cultures, all under one banner. But for how long? So here's your question. When a founder dies, what remains? Is it law, loyalty, fear, or the fragile thread of shared memory? With Genghis Khan gone, the world held its breath. Would the empire fracture like so many before it? Would the great promise dissolve into civil war and bloodshed? Ogadai Khan stepped into power amid whispers and unrest. He was different from his father Karma, less fiery but determined to maintain what had been built. The Mongol machine did not slow. In fact, it expanded. Under Ogadai, campaigns against the Jin dynasty intensified, and new fronts opened westward. The Khwarezmian Empire, vast and wealthy, lay in the path. Yet holding an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian was no small feat. Communication slowed over thousands of miles. Generals acted with increasing independence. Local leaders grew ambitious. Rebellions simmered. One of the earliest tests came in the form of the Merkits, the tribe that had once abducted Berta. Now they sought revenge. A coalition formed, attacking Mongol outposts. The empire responded swiftly, crushing the uprising with brutal efficiency. But these conflicts highlighted a growing problem. Loyalty was no longer personal. It was contractual, and contracts can be broken. Meanwhile, the sons of Genghis wrestled for power. Jochi's death before Genghis complicated matters. His descendants claimed their own stake, creating rival branches. Chagatai resisted the growing influence of Ogadai's line. Tolui, the youngest, remained a loyal force but had ambitions of his own. Civil war was a constant threat. Yet the empire endured because the system was designed to adapt. The Yam network kept communication flowing. Laws kept order. Military discipline maintained control. But the human element was fragile. One mistake, one betrayal, one rebellion could unravel centuries of conquest. The question remained, could an empire born from the will of one man survive the ambitions of many? Or was it doomed to splinter like the empires before it? What do you think? The horizon expanded, and with it, the Mongol Empire's reach. Their armies crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers that many had thought impassable. To the west, the Khwarezmian Empire lay sprawling rich with cities, trade, and intrigue. But it was a land as divided as the steppe had once been. When Genghis sent envoys to demand submission, the Khwarezm Shahan, ancient and proud ruler, responded not with diplomacy, but with violence. Envoys were killed, trade caravans destroyed. This was more than insult, it was a declaration of war. The Mongol response was swift and devastating. No longer merely raiders, they became conquerors of cities, rulers of people. In 1214, the Mongol forces stormed through Khwarezmian lands. They destroyed cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and urgent centers of culture, commerce, and history. The destruction was brutal. Entire populations were massacred or enslaved, but it was also strategic. Genghis Khan aimed not just to punish, but to send a message. The Mongol Empire was not a fleeting storm. It was a force reshaping the world. Yet, with every city taken, the Mongols absorbed more than land. They absorbed ideas, technologies, and cultures. They recruited engineers and scholars. They adopted new weapons and tactics. The empire's borders stretched farther than ever. But with distance came challenges. The steppe's direct control waned. The diversity of peoples under Mongol rule grew. Managing this mosaic required new approaches. Genghis's successors had to balance conquest with governance, fear with diplomacy, and the wider world began to notice. From Europe to the Middle East, rumors of the Mongol horde inspired awe and dread. Some called them unstoppable. Others wondered if they could be stopped at all. But for all the fear and destruction, the Mongols also facilitated a flow of goods, ideas, and people. The Silk Road flourished anew. Trade routes, once dangerous, became safer. Cultures collided and blended. Yet beneath this exchange lurked a profound question. Can an empire built on violence foster peace? Can the conquerors become protectors? Or will the scars of war always shadow their legacy? Every empire has a breaking point. For the Mongols, it came not from outside forces, but from within. As the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe, the challenges multiplied. The vastness that made it unstoppable also made it vulnerable. Communication slowed. Local rulers grew bolder. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan began to carve their own territories, turning loyalty into rivalry. And governing such a diverse population, Persians, Chinese, Turks, Russians, and more required compromises that tested Mongol traditions. The Yassa's harsh laws softened in places. Religious tolerance became more pragmatic than principled. The military machine grew more bureaucratic, less flexible. Where once speed and surprise were weapons, now heavy logistics slowed decisions. The empire's edges became contested. In the west, the Russian principalities pushed back. In the south, the Islamic world resisted Mongol rule with fierce determination. And the Mongol heartland faced pressure from new enemies and changing climates. Perhaps most critically, the death of strong leaders left power vacuums. Without Genghis Khan's iron will, personal ambitions clashed. The unity forged in blood and fire began to crack. Civil wars erupted between factions. Generals who once fought side by side now vied for dominance. The great network of communication faltered. The once feared Mongol cavalry lost its edge as armies adapted. And the question that haunted every corner of the empire became urgent. Could this vast machine, built on relentless conquest and cold law, survive the unpredictable forces of human nature? Or was its fall inevitable, another chapter in the endless cycle of rise and decay? What do you think was the most critical factor that led to the Mongol Empire's fragmentation? History is rarely a clean line. Empires rise and fall, but their stories ripple through time in ways that are often unexpected. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan's vision and iron will, did not simply vanish. It transformed. After decades of conquest and turmoil, the empire divided into Khanata's regional powers, ruled by Genghis's descendants. The Golden Horde dominated the west, influencing the future of Russia. The Ilkhanate shaped Persia and the Middle East. The Chagatai Khanate held Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, ruled over China. Each was different, adapting Mongol traditions to local realities. The empire's laws, systems, and networks remained foundations for these successor states. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, connecting east and west like never before. Cultural exchange blossomed. Ideas, inventions, and religions crossed borders. Even the plague, carried along these routes, changed the course of world history. The Mongols' legacy is complex. They were conquerors, yes, but also facilitators of connection in a fragmented world. They showed that a people once considered barbarians could shape civilizations. And they reminded us that power is not just about force, but about ideas, law, and the will to endure. But here's the final thought. How much of what we call civilization today owes its quietly, invisibly to the horses and laws of a steppe warrior who once rescued a captured bride and never gave up? Thank you for journeying through history with us on History in Ashes. Where are you watching from now? What time is it there? Drop a comment and let us know. And if you've enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. Because sometimes learning history feels like outrunning a Mongol cavalry better to be ready.